I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, it's a very good time of the year for us to be considering a bill like this because, as we know, winter is well and truly now upon us. And it reminds us about what it would be like to live permanently in a caravan or a car or a garage or any property which is not properly insulated. And those are issues which are not actually being very well faced up to by this government at this time. However, New Zealand First will support this bill, even though it could do so much more. It does only three things, in fact. First of all, it provides for smoke alarms, and nobody disagrees with that. They're well worthwhile and they will save lives. It does improve insulation for some homes, but with standards which are inadequate, and I'll come back to that later. And it does provide for regulations for a number of things, like the Chief Executive being able to take cases direct to the Tenancy Tribunal for persistent breaches of the regulations. It streamlines the process for recovery of possession where a tenant has skipped, and it increases penalties for breaches of regulations up to $4,000. All of that is good, no problem with that, but I would have to disagree with one provision for regulations, which is the one that says that allowing a landlord to state in a tenancy agreement that despite making reasonable efforts, they have not been able to satisfy themselves of the extent of insulation. Disagree with that. That will be a cop-out. It will mean that some landlords will use that as a means of escaping the regulations. It shouldn't be there. They should have to come up to the standards like anyone else, and if they can't establish what the insulation is, then that home simply shouldn't be on the market as a rental property. But, Mr Speaker, we could see much better from a bill like this. It is a lost opportunity, really, to improve New Zealand's rental stock over what it is now. And the two areas which many have spoken about and which I reiterate are that insulation standards for properties built between 1978 and either the 2001 or 2008 standards will not be adequate. And secondly, the lack of any worthwhile, genuine heating standards. This bill means that properties built between 1978 and 2001 with installation standards that were in force over that period will be forever, permanently exempted from coming up to the 2008 standards, and that's a great shame. I would have thought that over time, all properties should have to come up to those standards whenever they were built. Now, the rationale that we hear from the members opposite is that because around 80% of the two modern insulation standards would be achieved by the 1978 standard, it would be unnecessary and uneconomic to upgrade those properties to the higher standard. But I don't accept that that's actually even factually correct, because there will be a lot of properties that will be under even those standards, and of course some that will be over it. It'll be patchy, and I know that as a matter of fact because I had my home built in 1984, shortly after the 1978 standards came in, and I remember investigating methods of insulation and all kinds of things which complied with those regulations, and some were good and some were not very good, and I hope that I chose a reasonably good one. But the fact is that there'll be a lot of properties built to the 1978 standards that are clearly not very well insulated at all. And that's just a fact which the figures that are bandied about by the Minister won't reveal. And the other claim made is if the cost of upgrading to the modern standards was imposed on the properties built after 1978, then that would cause that cost to be passed on to the tenants, the rents would increase, and so on. Now, that actually is completely untrue. That is not the way markets work. A regulation creates a level playing field, as they say, lifting all ships with the higher tide. So there are no grounds for one landlord increasing rents for this class of home over another, and they wouldn't get away with it in the market. What, of course, does increase rents is house prices, because rents are based on the recovery of the cost of capital of houses. And that is today what's driving the rent increases, and therefore it's actually the fault entirely of this government for doing nothing about increased house prices and for its complete mismanagement of the housing portfolio in New Zealand, because it is that which has caused the increase of house prices, and it's that which has caused the increase of rents, not a regulation which would require a better standard of insulation. So the members opposite who are trying to argue that are delusional over what really does cause increased rents. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, if the government really was concerned about rent increases because of increasing insulation standards for the 1978 and after properties, then it could, if it wished, expense the whole of the cost, allow landlords to expense the whole of the cost of insulation upgrades in the year that the expense was actually incurred. That would be a significant incentive to landlords to invest in insulation. And it would therefore not matter at all whether the property was built before or after 1978 or which standard of insulation applied to it. So as far as we in New Zealand First are concerned, there should be no difference whenever a property was built for the purposes of insulation standards. But if a property was built after 1978 and had insulation standards that were too far below standard, it would be reasonable to have a longer period of time for compliance, maybe 8 or 10 years to do that. And if that had been in this legislation, that would have been supportable. But what is not supportable is that those properties will never be required to come up to modern standards. And in fact, looking further forward, as technologies improve, what we should have is a regime that says that we will act to improve all rental housing stock progressively up to whatever the modern standards of the day would be, allowing, of course, a reasonable time to do that. And if everyone is required to do that, every landlord is required to do that, then there will be no market penalty or advantage over any landlord, one over the other. So there should be no problem in doing that, and that's what we should be aiming for in this country. Now, Mr. Speaker, lastly, I simply want to say that heating and ventilation must also be subject to minimum requirements for performance of a property, because there's not much point in having minimum requirements for insulation and then over time making sure that all rental properties come up to those standards, unless there is also a performance standard for heating and for ventilation. That's just common sense, and why this bill doesn't move into that area, I just can't understand. And the truth is, as many others have said, and as many submitters said, the cost savings in the avoidance of illness alone and the avoidance of a whole raft of social problems that arise from inadequately insulated and inadequately heated homes is just so huge that it makes a bill like this and much more totally justified. Much more should be done, much more savings should be incurred, much less illness would result. And so the matter is really urgent. So in the end, New Zealand First is really disappointed that the bill doesn't go further. In that respect, we would like to see it do so. As far as we're concerned, this is just a work in progress for the next government.
I call Pamji Pama.